and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amaris. Today I'm painting an arrowhead. It belonged to someone who has become rather famous, not so much for how he lived, but for how he died. The reference photo I'm using is from a paper by Ursula Weirer and colleagues, and I'll leave the link to the image and a citation of the paper below the video. A small note of apology here. My memory card ran out of space partway through the painting, so there's going to be a big jump between not very done to almost done. So, sorry about that. Let's set the scene. September 19th, 1991. Two German hikers, Erika and Helmut Simon, decide to take a shortcut off the main trail. They're in the Ötzl Alps, high on the border between Austria and Italy. They're not looking for history. They're just tired. But then Erika sees something odd sticking out of the melting ice. A brown shape. A shoe? No. A body. At first, everyone thinks it's a recent accident. A lost climber? Maybe a ski patrol casualty. But when the rescue team tries to chip him out with a jackhammer, bad idea by the way, they realize that the ice has other plans. This isn't a modern hiker. This is a man who's been frozen for over 5,000 years. Today, while I paint a watercolor of one of the objects found with him, a small flaked arrowhead, I want to tell you the story of Ötzi, the Iceman, Europe's oldest natural human mummy, and the world's oldest unsolved murder case. Let's get into it. First, a warning. The man you're about to meet did not die of old age. He was killed. And his body, along with his gear, is a time capsule of the Copper Age, also called the Chalcolithic period. Ötzi lived about 3300 BCE. That's roughly 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. To put that in perspective, when Ötzi was breathing, walking, and bleeding in the Alps, woolly mammoths still existed on Wrangel Island in the Arctic. They wouldn't go extinct for another 600 years. Ötzi was about 45 years old when he died, which for his time was ancient. Most people didn't make it past 30. He was 5'3", or 160 centimeters tall, weighed around 110 pounds or 50 kilos, had brown eyes, was lactose intolerant, and had the genetic markers for heart disease. His lungs were blackened with soot from sitting too close to campfires. He had whipworm parasites in his intestines. His teeth were a mess from eating too much gritty, coarsely ground bread. And he had arthritis in his knees, hips, and lower back. In other words, he was tough, but he was falling apart. But here's the thing, he was incredibly prepared for the mountains. When he died, he was carrying a backpack frame, a fur hat, a grass cloak, leggings made of goatskin, and shoes stuffed with grass for insulation. And most importantly for us, a quiver. Inside that quiver, 14 arrows. Most were unfinished or broken, just shafts with no tips. But 2 were fully functional, with flint points ready to go. One of those arrows, a perfectly formed, leaf-shaped point made from Jurassic chert, a type of fine-grained stone similar to flint, is what I'm painting right now. This isn't just a rock. This was a weapon designed to kill. And as we'll find out, something similar might have been used on Ötzi. Or maybe not. The story gets complicated. Let's look closely at this object. Ötzi's arrowhead is about 1.5 inches, or just under 4 centimeters long, leaf-shaped, with a tang at the base. That's the narrow part that would have been hafted onto a wooden shaft using birch tar and sinew. The edges are serrated from pressure flaking. You can see the ripple marks where the flint napper struck it. Those aren't accidental. That's the hallmark of human craftsmanship. A natural rock doesn't look like that. Here's what's interesting. Ötzi's arrowheads weren't all made from the same stone. Scientists led by Dr. Ursula Weirer analyzed the chert and found it came from 3 different sources, some from as far away as 40 miles or 65 kilometers. That means that Ötzi either traveled widely or traded with people who did. His tools were precious to him. Many showed signs of having been resharpened and repaired multiple times. He didn't have the luxury of wasting good stone. Now, here's where it gets dark. When scientists CT scanned Ötzi's body in 2001, they found something lodged inside his left shoulder, a flint arrowhead. But not one of his, a different one. The arrowhead in his shoulder was triangular, not leaf-shaped, and it was buried deep. So deep that the entry wound was on his back, below his left shoulder blade. The arrow had been shot from below and slightly to the left, as if the shooter was crouching or aiming uphill. The arrow shaft was removed before he died, but the tip remained. It severed a major blood vessel near his subclavian artery. He would have bled internally into his chest cavity within minutes or hours. Death was inevitable, even if someone had tried to save him. So the arrowhead I'm painting? That's one of his own arrows. It was found in his quiver, ready for use. But the one that killed him was fired by someone else, and we still don't know who or why. Before we dive into the murder theories, let's talk about what happened after the discovery, because it's a mess. When the Simons found Ötzi, they weren't gentle. Nobody was. The body was frozen solid below the torso, so a mountain gendarme and a hut keeper tried to free it using a pneumatic drill and ice axes. They damaged the hip area. A few days later, the body was extracted, forced into a coffin, and transported to Innsbruck, Austria. During that trip, someone broke Ötzi's left arm. Then, once the body was lying on a mortuary slab in the lab, fungus started growing on his skin. It took 5 days before anyone thought to stabilize the mummy properly. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because Ötzi was found right on the border, a diplomatic fight broke out. Austria claimed him at first, since the hikers had crossed into Austrian territory, but when surveyors mapped the site more carefully, they discovered the body was actually 92.5 meters inside Italy. So Italy said, he's ours. After years of legal battles, Ötzi was moved to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he remains today in a custom cold cell kept at -6 degrees Celsius. And the finders? Helmut and Erika Simon fought for 17 years to get a reward. They finally received 150,000 euros, but unfortunately Helmut passed away before the prize was paid out. So that's the backstory. Now let's talk about what Ötzi was carrying, and why it matters. Ötzi's most famous possession is his copper axe, and this thing is a bombshell. When he was found, the axe was lying near his body, a blade of almost pure copper, 99.7% pure, hafted onto a yew wood handle with birch tar and leather straps. At first, archaeologists assumed the copper came from the Alps. There are known deposits nearby. But in 2017, a team led by Dr. Gilberto Artioli at the University of Padua did a lead isotope analysis on the blade, and the results were shocking. The copper came from southern Tuscany, over 300 miles or 500 kilometers away. So what does this mean? This means that 5,300 years ago, long-distance trade networks already existed. Copper was incredibly rare and valuable. Owning a copper axe wasn't like owning a fancy car. It was like owning a private jet. It marked Ötzi as someone of high status, a chief, a clan leader, a wealthy leader, or perhaps a shaman. But here's the twist. The axe was found with him, not stolen. If he was murdered by someone who wanted his power, why leave behind the most valuable object he owned? That question has fueled decades of debate. We'll come back to it. First, let's inventory the rest of his gear, because some of it's pretty interesting. Here's what Ötzi had on him when he died, piece by piece. 1. 2 pieces of birch polypore fungus threaded onto a leather string. For decades we thought it was tinder for starting fires, but newer research suggests it had antibiotic and anti-parasite properties. It's possible that Ötzi was medicating himself. 2. A fire starting kit. A lump of pyrite, which we discussed in a previous episode, and a piece of tinder fungus and a flint flake. He could make a spark even in freezing rain. That's survival expertise. 3. A small leather pouch containing a bone awl and a flint scraper. 4. A dagger. But here's a sad detail. The dagger was tiny, barely a couple inches, maybe 10 centimeters long, and its tip was broken. He couldn't sharpen it properly because he had run out of good chert. In his final days, he was improvising with worn-out tools. 5. A longbow. Unfinished. He was in the process of carving it when he died. That's crucial. It means he wasn't just passing through. He stopped, sat down, and started making gear. That suggests he was hiding, or stranded, or waiting for something, or someone. 6. A net made of tree bark, possibly for carrying food or catching birds. 7. A quiver with 2 finished arrowheads, the one I'm painting, and another one, and 12 unfinished shafts. He was preparing for something, but he ran out of time. So, a powerful man, dressed for the mountains, carrying medicine, fire, weapons, and the raw materials to make more weapons. He stopped at a high-altitude pass and started working on a new bow. And then someone shot him in the back. The question is, why? Over the past 3 decades, researchers have proposed multiple theories about Ötzi's death. Let me walk you through 3 of the most compelling ones. Theory 1. A power struggle or political assassination. This theory says Ötzi wasn't just any shepherd. He was a leader, a chieftain, or a headman. Evidence for this includes the copper axe from Tuscany, a high-status object, his high-protein diet that was better than average for his time, and his age. 45 was unusually old, suggesting that he had the resources to survive longer than most other people. In this scenario, Ötzi was killed by someone from his own community, or a neighboring group, who wanted his position. The attack wasn't random. It was a targeted assassination. The shooter came from below, suggesting they knew his route. After the arrow struck, Ötzi fled uphill, not downhill, which is what most wounded people would do. Why go up? Possibly because his attackers were coming from below, and he had nowhere else to go. The removal of the arrow shaft is also strange. If you shoot someone and want them dead, you usually leave the arrow in. It causes more bleeding. Removing it suggests the killer didn't want to leave evidence. Or perhaps Ötzi pulled it out himself in a desperate attempt to survive. But here's the problem with this theory. If you're assassinating a leader to steal his power, why leave behind the copper axe? That's like killing a king and not taking the crown. Unless the murder was meant to look like an accident. If the axe was missing, people would suspect theft. If the axe was left behind, it looked like Ötzi simply died of exposure. A cover-up. That's theory 1. Theory 2 is a ritual sacrifice. This one comes from researchers like Johann Reinhard, who discovered Inca child mummies on the Andean peaks. The idea is that Ötzi was a religious figure, a shaman or priest, who was sacrificed and placed on a sacred mountain. The high-altitude location, the careful arrangement of his belongings, not scattered, but clustered, and the fact that his body was found face down with his arms crossed all suggest ritual placement, not random death. The counterpoint to this is that sacrificial victims are usually killed cleanly, strangled, bled, or given poison. Being shot in the back and then left to bleed out for hours doesn't fit most known sacrifice rituals. Also, pollen evidence suggests he died in spring or early summer, not a typical festival time. Still, it's a popular theory in documentaries. And the third theory, a clan battle or a revenge killing. This is the simplest explanation. Ötzi was caught in a violent skirmish between rival groups. He had defensive wounds on his hands, a deep cut on his right thumb that hadn't healed, and also a gash on his wrist. Those look like someone had tried to block a knife attack. He also had healed rib fractures from an earlier fight. This wasn't his first rodeo. In this version, Ötzi was part of a raiding party or hunting group that got ambushed. He fled into the mountains, his companions were killed or scattered, and he bled out alone. The different style of arrowhead, triangular versus his own leaf-shaped points, suggests the killer came from a different cultural group. That's significant. It wasn't an insider. It was an outsider. Each theory has evidence. None is proven. And that's why Ötzi remains so fascinating, because 5,300 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. And then the counter theory to all of these. Was he even murdered at all? There's a radical alternative. In 2010, a team led by Alessandro Vanzetti of the University of Rome proposed that Ötzi wasn't murdered. Instead, they argued his death scene was actually a ceremonial burial. Here's their evidence. When they mapped the exact locations of Ötzi's belongings around his body, they found the items weren't scattered randomly, as you'd expect from a dying man collapsing. They were carefully arranged a few meters away from the body. That suggests that someone, his companions, placed them there deliberately, as grave goods. Also, his bow was unfinished. Why would a living man carry an unusable bow into a dangerous mountain pass? That doesn't make sense. But as a burial offering? Absolutely. People have been buried with unfinished objects as symbolic gifts for millennia. And then there's the timing problem. Ötzi's last meal, red deer and einkorn wheat, was eaten in the spring. But the pollen found in the ice around his body dates his final location to August or September. That's a 4 to 5 month gap. How? Vanzetti argues that Ötzi died in spring, but his body was kept somewhere, perhaps on a platform or in a cold cave, until late summer when the ice melted enough for a proper mountain burial. If this theory is correct, then the arrowhead in his shoulder wasn't a murder weapon. It could have been an old wound that never healed, or it could have been placed there ritually after his death. Most archaeologists don't accept this theory. The CT scan evidence of internal bleeding, the defensive wounds on his hands, and the fact that the arrow was shot from below all points to violence. But it's a reminder that even our most famous murder victim might be telling a different story. The ice doesn't give up its secrets easily. So here we are, 5,300 years ago. A 45-year-old man with bad teeth, sooty lungs, and a copper axe from Tuscany walked up a mountain. He carried medicine, fire, and weapons. He sat down to work on a new bow, and then something happened. An arrow, a flight uphill, a slow bleed, and a freeze that lasted 53 centuries. His name wasn't Ötzi. That's a nickname from the Oeggl Valley, where he was found. We don't know what his people called him. We don't know if he had children, or a spouse, or enemies who cheered when he fell. But we have his face, reconstructed from CT scans. We have his last meal. We have his tattoos, 61 of them, made from soot rubbed into cuts. And we have his arrowheads, including the one I'm painting. If you'd like to see the reference photo I used, or the actual CT scans of the arrowhead in Ötzi's shoulder, check the description below. And if you ever find yourself in Bolzano, Italy, go see him. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology keeps him in a cold cell where you can look through a small window at the world's oldest cold case. Thank you for joining me on this visit to the Alps in the Copper Age. If you've enjoyed our exploration, I hope you'll join me for future episodes. And maybe you have some ideas for future topics you'd like to leave in the comments. I have a list of ideas, but it's not that long. See you next time!